Let's spend a moment to appreciate the simple chopper. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, on this channel we look at all types of swords, all types of weapons, hopefully, although we do focus quite a lot on swords, because frankly that's what most of you, I think, want to hear about. Swords are glamorous, there's a lot written about them, there's very complex fencing systems for them. Many cultures have their own very characteristic and developed swords, but a lot of the swords we focus on are pretty long bladed and sometimes quite specialised. So for example, you know, the small sword is very specialised towards the civilian duel against another person with a small sword. The rapier is equally a relatively specialised sword. It can be used in war, of course, but also used in the duel, often accompanied with a dagger or another accompanying weapon. It's very long, it's very thrust centric, it's got a lot of hand protection. Something like the basket-hilted Highland broadsword or the English backsword has got very developed hand protection, the most developed hand protection pretty much, along with the Italian Scavona, for example. But it's a cut and thrust sword, predominantly used for cutting, although can obviously also be used for thrusting. Then we look at medieval swords, we see specialised thrusting swords or swords with particularly designed points which sacrifice some of their cutting potential. But what's interesting is, across periods and across geographies, often what we find is that cultures that have had specialised swords often come back to the good old chopper. Now, not to say that this is only a chopper, but this is not particularly long, it's not particularly heavy, it's not insanely light either. It's got a fairly broad blade and it's got a point on it. And this basic formula for a successful infantry person's sword or civilian sword, so the person who's going to use a sword on foot for fighting in a multiple range of different types of environments and situations, we often come back to this basic format. Now we're going to look at a few examples here. I've got a slightly more developed, so this is the Krieger historical weapons Langmesser, a 15th century type of sword, very popular in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the 16th and 17th centuries this developed a little bit further, so some people would call this a falchion or a dussac, and you know, it's a very clearly related weapon. Fundamentally a fairly similar type of blade. This one's a little bit heavier, a little bit chunkier, a little bit less pointy at the end, and it's got a little bit more hand protection, but basically it's a slightly later period version of this. Now, if we go back in time into the 15th century, we actually find similar parallels for this in England. This is an English late 15th century style of sword, of which there's a few examples surviving, a couple of good ones in the Royal Armouries. And again, it's got the same basic format. You'll notice it's about the same kind of size. It's a predominantly single-edged blade. This one is more pointy. Bear in mind, this was used more in the age of plate armour, the Wars of the Roses kind of period, so you need to have a very functional point that can maybe pierce through a padded jack, layers of linen, or indeed even mail, chainmail in the gaps between plate armour, for example. This being a little bit later when people were wearing less armour in general, most soldiers were wearing less armour, so therefore you don't need such an armour-piercing tip. So there are modifications to the design, there are particulars to the design, but overall it's basically predominantly a single-edged, relatively short, medium-sized chopper with some degree of hand protection in this case. If we flip over to the Middle East, should we say, or go down to the Ottoman Empire, then we have the yataghan. Now, many of you will know about the Turkish or Ottoman kiliç or pala, the sabre essentially, used by more affluent types of soldiers, officers essentially, and also cavalry. But the people on foot, the standard infantry, their standard infantry sidearm, apart from their main weapon, which would be a firearm or a bow or a spear, usually a polearm of some kind, their sidearm would usually be the yataghan, as shown here. And this is an original example, antique example from the Balkans, so what was formerly the Ottoman Empire, but fundamentally it's a Turkish weapon. Now, if we go back, so these were being used in the 16th century. If we go to the European dussac, you'll notice they're a pretty similar size, aren't they? And they're predominantly cutting weapons. They're very wieldable and handy in a press, in a battle. Very easy to wear because they're not particularly long, and I'll probably come back to these points in a minute. The Turkish weapon, incidentally, doesn't have much hand protection on it, and that's a compromise. For the most part, European weapons, certainly by the 17th century, have generally got a lot more hand protection on them than Ottoman Turkish weapons do. But that being said, Ottoman Turkish weapons are very often being used with a shield, and also, you know, there's some advantage to having less hand protection in terms of wearing the weapon. It's less likely to get in the way, and sometimes accessing it quickly. Even if we look at George Silver's treatise from 1599, you will notice he actually talks about one of the problems with enclosed basket hilts being, at the moment when you need to get the sword out quickly, you can't necessarily get your hand in there immediately. And of course, you've got to remember that these are very often backup weapons, so being able to get a weapon out quickly is important. I won't labour that point too heavily. But now if we go way further over to the east, then we can go all the way to Burma and Thailand and Vietnam, and we find the Da. Now, on the surface of it, this looks like a very different type of weapon, doesn't it? But just ignore that extension. Really, this is here predominantly for balance. If you ignore that extended grip, this is basically a one-handed weapon. It's got a similar lack of hand protection to the Turkish weapon. And fundamentally, it's a chopper. Yes, you can stab with all of these things. You can stab with any pointed piece of metal. But fundamentally, it's in the same ballpark of size, and it has a swell in the width of the blade towards the tip. So it is fundamentally a chopper. And again, it's in the ballpark of the Langmesser. It's in the ballpark of the Dusak in terms of size. And all of these, you know, they vary slightly in their tip shape. They vary slightly in their width and their thickness of blade and their mass and stuff like this. But fundamentally, this is a medium size, close range chopper. Okay, we've come back to choppers. Now, if we go over to China, all the way over to China, what was pretty much one of the most common war swords and swords for people who weren't scholars or gentlemen, the Dao. Now, interestingly, Dao basically means knife or single-edged bladed object, single-edged bladed weapon, and a Dao can refer to certain types of glaive-like polearm. It can refer to a knife, and indeed it refers to this type of sword, as we'd call it. So a jian is obviously the straight double-edged sword. The Dao is the single-edged, relatively short sword for the most part. Yes, you do get giant ones, of course, but most of them are this kind of size. And let's just do a little bit of a size comparison here. Very, very comparable, okay? Now, interestingly, as is often the case with Asian weapons, we often have a longer grip than you necessarily need for one hand. Yes, theoretically, you could put two hands on it if you want. That's not how they were predominantly used. This seems to have been quite typical within Asia as an idea of balancing a weapon. And again, we've got a parallel here between the Da and the Dao, which similar to at least to this British person, are similar sounding words, but actually different words, of course. And obviously the Da takes the long extended grip to the extreme, as in some cases to things like wakasashis in Japan as well, and various other swords that you'll find in Asia. But so really that extra length there, yes, you can use it for hooking shields or hooking people's arms and things like this, but predominantly I think originally it's there basically for balance, to make this weapon more quick and responsive in the hand and bring that point of balance back towards the hand very easily just by extending the grip. I believe similar explanation with the Chinese Dao. And this, again in the hand, it feels extremely similar to the European Dusak. And really, apart from the level of hand protection. Now, there is an interesting little detail about hand protection. So I've noticed that even on these earliest, these are both 15th century design Langmesser. Well, this is a hanger, as we would call it in 15th century England, and the Germans would call this a Langmesser. In both of these situations, we start to see some of the earliest additional hand protection on swords in Europe on what we call falchions, hangers and langmessers, or related swords. Now on the German Langmesser, famously it has the Nagel or nail sticking out of the side, and in this case it has a knuckle bow. On the English example we have a knuckle bow and we have the Nagel has grown out to a sidebar on this particular replica, although some of them in England just do simply have a Nagel, a lug sticking out at the side. So we've got a side projection and a front projection. Why might that be? Well, that's a massive topic and I'll probably talk about that in a future video, but there is some correlation there between things which have similar-ish size blades and type of blades and therefore use, and the requirement for a bit of added hand protection. What's interesting is this added hand protection at the side, and we do see some techniques in Langmesser where the flat of the blade is used to defend and therefore a blade could slide down, so the Nagel is there to stop the opponent's blade sliding off the side. Okay, now that's not something we generally see on cross-hilted swords. Cross-hilted swords in most sources would be used to defend with the base of the edge, and therefore if the opponent's blade slid down it would land on the crossguard, okay, or quillon sticking out here. We don't have Nagel on most double-edged swords because they're not usually used to defend with the flat. Okay, contrary to what some people will tell you, they are generally defending with either the back edge or the front edge, and therefore the crossguard defends there. If you are occasionally, for whatever reason, and again I'll go into this in more depth in another video, if for some reason you're defending with the flat of the blade, you need a projection at the side which isn't covered by the front or rear quillon, and therefore you have the Nagel. Similar kind of thing if we've got the side bar in this case, or on the later Dussac we have a side ring or sometimes shell guard, and in fact some of the shell guards get very, very big and start to form the beginnings of a basket hilt, and that's probably where basket hilts originate. I think it's interesting that European swords of this kind of size and this kind of type had this added hand protection, partly because of the type of soldiers in war who would be using them who wouldn't be wearing gauntlets. But it is interesting to note that if we look at Chinese, Japanese and Korean swords, and a few others as well, they tend to have the disc guard. Now the origins of the disc guard are somewhat obscure. It is something I've been researching on the side, and again more about that in the future. But it is interesting to me that these, much like those European swords, they have front and rear protection. They also have additional side protection, which might suggest that historically when these were being used they were sometimes taking essentially defences on the flat of the blade with the projecting guards at the side, therefore having that added protection in case the opponent's blade slid down towards the hand. But the real headline here is that if we look all over the world, and even as another example, I forgot to show this one yet, the Filipino barong in this case. Now the barong is obviously smaller. There are always going to be technological considerations to bring in here in terms of what materials available, how much material, and how is that material manufactured and heat treated. So if you're using woots, or if you're using edge quenching, if you're using spring tempering, different carbon levels, different types of steel, then that's going to dictate to some degree what shape and form your blade takes. But fundamentally, although this superficially looks very different to a yataghan, actually they're not hugely different. They can both stab, but they're both predominantly cutting swords. And actually look, they've got kind of some basic similarities in the designs of the hilts. Neither of them have got a guard. They've both got this hooked kind of beak-like projection at the pommel end, which means that when you're swinging the weapon it stays in your hand and won't swing out. Okay, the fact that they're not predominantly thrusting weapons is demonstrated by the design of the hilts, showing they don't really have an awful lot to stop the hand pushing up towards the tip when you meet a resisting target. But in both these cases, for the most part, they're not going to be being used against armour or stuff like that. So although they look superficially very different, actually in practical purpose, if you were trained to use a yataghan and someone handed you a Filipino barong, you could use it pretty well, in the same way that if you were trained to use a 15th century Langmesser, okay, and that's what you'd used all your life, but for whatever reason you ended up with a yataghan in your hand, you could use that fairly adeptly, really. You'd be like, oh, where's the guard? But apart from that, you could thrust a bit and you could cut with it just the same as you could do with the Langmesser, with some changes. And equally, if you went to China, if you were a 15th century or 16th century European and you got shipwrecked on the coast of China and ended up with a dao in your hand, that'd be no real problem. You'd be like, well, it's a falchion, it's a messer, it's a hanger, okay? No big problem. So I think it's really interesting that with all of these fancy and usually longer sword designs that we come up with, you know, rapiers, sabres, long swords, estocks, small swords, all of the things that we've come up with in history for specific purposes and specific types of soldier or specific scenarios, or civilian life, dueling, whatever. At the end of the day, across the world and across periods, and we could take this back into the ancient world with the gladius and the copis and the falcata and the khopesh, and we often end up with swords that are approximately of this kind of size, so what we'd perhaps in the modern world term a short sword, because in fact historically they're not particularly short, they're kind of average, and actually the other swords are longer than average. But compared to the swords we're most used to, like, you know, long swords, back swords, rapiers and sabres, these are on the short side. But throughout history and across geography, the so-called short sword that is predominantly choppy is incredibly prevalent in human history. Now, finally, I just want to consider, why should that be? Okay, you're welcome to post your ideas below as to why you think that swords of medium size that are predominantly chopping weapons with some hand protection some of the time, why are they so popular throughout history, across the centuries, across the world, across geographies, with oceans between them and everything else? Why do we keep coming back to this basic design? Well, I think there's a number of things. The main things, in my view, are, number one, they're easy to wear. Okay, when you're wearing something like this dao or this Langmesser, they are small enough and light enough, and their hilts don't stick out a long way like a longsword hilt, or laterally like a basket hilt or a rapier, that you basically don't notice they're there. Okay, once you've been wearing one of these types of swords, a medium size short choppy sword that's not very heavy, you kind of don't notice it's there. Within an hour, it's just there. It's just an appendage to your belt, and it's there when you need it, but it can just hang there. You can use pole weapons, you can use firearms or bows or anything else. You can ride a horse, walk up and down stairs, climb into ships, get in and out of carriages and carts and wagons and chariots and things like this, and it's just not really a problem. So number one, it's really convenient to wear everywhere. And remember, the weapon that you wear everywhere is the weapon that's going to be there when you need it, okay, like a pistol or a knife. Now, the next thing is, I think fundamentally choppy things. Why do we always come back to choppy things? I think that is human nature, okay? If you put a weapon in a typical person's hand and you put them in a stressful situation where they're fighting for their life or trying to kill someone or ransacking a building or whatever, predominantly the way that most people attack is this. Okay, and statistically that's even today shown to be the case in modern crime reports. If someone picks up a knife or dagger under stress, they will very often hold it point down and do this. It's the caveman or ape instinct to pick something up and do this with it, predominantly from your dominant side, so for a right-handed person, from the right-hand side downwards. And this type of weapon works really, really well with that, as does a stick or a club or mace or an axe or something like, or a machete. Equally, we could also say muscle memory. I don't like that expression, but muscle memory. If you've done any type of physical labour, be it hammering nails into wood, or be it chopping through rainforests, or chopping up wood for the fire, then this motion downwards from your dominant side is going to be the motion that your body is most used to, and it's what your muscles are best set up to do. Okay, so this weapon works very well with that. It's instinctive, regardless how much you teach people how to thrust or lunge with the correct footwork and everything else. When the proverbial hits the fan, what most people do is this. Okay, so if that works well with the weapon you're holding, hooray, good, easy, okay? In that sense, it doesn't require so much training, or rather whatever training someone's had, they'll fall back on using something in a more or less effective way. The final reason is something I've touched on in recent videos, and that is in combat, you often end up closer in a whether it's a skirmish, a street fight, a melee, a battle, you end up closer with opponents generally than you would want to do in a one-on-one combat such as a duel. So I think the duel situation particularly favours long swords where you can try and outreach the other person and hit them from far away. In real combat, sometimes because of armour, sometimes because of shields, sometimes because you're in a big mass and body of people who are all squished together, and for a whole bunch of other reasons, psychological and physical, you often end up very, very close to people. And very, very close to people, longer swords can be a hindrance, okay? Up close, you can be literally wrestling with someone, and with this length sword, or a shorter one, or a knife or a dagger, of course, you can still have your arm around someone's neck and you can still stab them in the armpit, in the gut. You can still swing it down at their leg and cut their hamstrings. You can still use it effectively at very, very close range, which you can't necessarily do with with a longer sword. If you're in this distance, yes, there's other things you can do with this sword, and we know all that from the longsword treatises, but they become more unwieldy. So, I hope this has been thought-provoking. You might massively disagree, and that's fine. That's what we're here to do. We're here to have a discussion, use our brains, think about the topic, bring in evidence from history and ethnographic studies of how weapons are even used and made today. Everything. What do you think about this topic? Why do you think so many bits of the world, whether it's the Middle East or Asia or Africa or Europe, always come back to this medium-sized or shortish sword that's predominantly choppy? I think I've probably covered most of the reasons, but maybe there's something I've missed. I'll see you in the comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, and I'll see you back on the channel again soon. I am Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.